In 1943, the United States government bought more than 1,000 family farms in the mountains of western North Carolina for an average of $37.76 per acre. Then they burned the houses down. Then they flooded the valley. Then they promised to build a road back. The road was supposed to be 30 miles long. They built 6. It ends at a tunnel blasted through a mountain ridge. 1,200 feet of darkness, unlit, never driven through by a single car. On the other side, the pavement stops and the forest begins. The graves are still out there, past the tree line, across the water, scattered in 26 cemeteries on hillsides that no road reaches. This is the story of how a promise got made, how it got broken, and why, 80 years later, people still walk through that tunnel to get to the other side. Before we talk about the road, we need to talk about what used to be here. Because the biggest lie the landscape tells you today is that this was always wilderness. The north shore of what is now Fontana Lake in Swain County, North Carolina, was settled country. Not scattered cabins, settled country. Families had lived along the Little Tennessee River and its tributaries since before the Revolution. By the early 1900s, the Hazel Creek drainage alone supported a string of communities that felt, to the people who lived in them, like the whole world. Proctor was the biggest. Established in 1886 as a farming settlement, it became a genuine boom town when the W.M. Ritter Lumber Company arrived in 1907 and built a massive sawmill on Hazel Creek. Within a few years, Proctor had a population somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people. It had a doctor, a dentist, a barber, a cafe, a school, a train depot, because Ritter had built a narrow-gauge railroad 16 miles into the drainage to haul timber out. It had a movie theater. It had local telephone service. Folks who visited Knoxville sometimes came back unimpressed, because Proctor already had electricity and Knoxville in some neighborhoods did not. And it had Strutton Street, which ran along the south side of Hazel Creek, where the Ritter offices and commissary stood on boardwalks, and Calico Street on the other side, and you could walk from one end of town to the other and know everybody you passed. Picture that. 1,000 people in a mountain valley so remote you could only reach it by rail or by a single rough road, and they had boardwalks and they had a picture show and they were doing fine. Ritter pulled out in 1928. The company had taken more than 200 million board feet of lumber from the Hazel Creek watershed, roughly 650,000 trees. When there was nothing left that was easy to reach, Ritter moved its operations to Nantahala, and the jobs went with it. Proctor shrank back down to a farming community. People who had come for the mill left. But the families who had been there before the mills stayed. They had gardens and livestock and a creek full of trout, and they had their dead buried in the hillsides above the valley floor, and they had no particular reason to leave. They didn't know it yet, but an aluminum company in Tennessee was about to take a very strong interest in their river. The Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, operated the largest aluminum plant in the world just across the mountains in Tennessee. Aluminum requires staggering amounts of electricity to produce. In the 1930s, Alcoa bought up about 15,000 acres along the Little Tennessee River with an eye toward a future dam. The Tennessee Valley Authority had been thinking about the same site since its founding in 1933, but Alcoa controlled the land, and the politics were complicated, and congressional funding for what would be an enormously expensive project in a remote gorge seemed like a long shot. Then came December 7, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, everything about Fontana Dam stopped being theoretical. President Roosevelt had already demanded 50,000 planes for the Air Force, and Alcoa's plants were spinning up to produce the aluminum for them. But Alcoa needed more electricity than the existing dams could provide. In 1941, Alcoa gave its Fontana property to the federal government. A bill authorizing construction of the dam was signed 10 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And just 3 weeks after the day of infamy, The first TVA trucks rumbled up the narrow dirt roads into the gorge to start building. Now, here is the detail that makes this story something more than a tale of wartime infrastructure. The families being moved off their land were told the dam was needed to power aluminum production for aircraft. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. 45 miles away, in a place called Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the federal government was building something else, something so secret that not even the chairman of the TVA knew what it was. Oak Ridge was the largest site in the Manhattan Project, the sprawling effort to build the first atomic bombs. Its uranium enrichment plants consumed millions of kilowatts of electricity. A significant portion of Fontana Dam's power was destined for Oak Ridge from the beginning. The mountain families who gave up their land to help win the war were, in a very literal sense, powering the development of nuclear weapons. They just didn't know it. Nobody told them until August of 1945, when the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the secret was no longer a secret. And there is one more thing the displaced families might have found worth knowing. The electricity Fontana Dam generated, all that power produced from their valley, their river, their flooded land, none of it has ever been used in Swain County. None of it has ever been used anywhere in western North Carolina. The power lines run to Tennessee. They always have. But in the winter of 1942, none of that mattered yet because the dam was coming whether anyone liked it or not, and it was coming fast. The TVA built an entire town in the wilderness to house the workforce. Fontana Village had 19 dormitories, a cafeteria seating 1,000, a 50-bed hospital, a business district, nearly 400 houses, 400 trailers, 2 schools, racially segregated, because this was 1942, libraries, softball fields, and movie theaters. To keep the workers motivated through their round-the-clock 7-day-a-week shifts, TVA piped military marches and big band music through a public address system that reached every corner of the camp. At peak construction, 5,000 workers from 48 states were on site. The project manager was a tall, scholarly engineer named C.E. Blee, and under his supervision, the crews poured 2.8 million cubic yards of concrete into a gorge so narrow that engineers worried the heat released by the setting concrete would crack the dam from the inside out. They solved the problem by threading the structure with cooling coils like veins in a body. The dam was finished on November 11, 1944, Armistice Day as it happens. It stood 480 feet tall, the highest dam east of the Rocky Mountains, a distinction it still holds. It had cost $74.7 million, required 34.5 million man-hours of labor, and it held back a reservoir that was 29 miles long, covered more than 10,000 acres, and averaged 130 feet deep. 2 generating units came online in January 1945, and the electricity started flowing to Alcoa and to Oak Ridge. And the war ground on for 7 more months, and then it was over. The towns at the bottom of the reservoir were not over. They were under 130 feet of water, or close enough. More than 1,300 families had been displaced. The TVA acquired 1,064 tracts of land, and the average price paid was $37.76 per acre. Some families got even less. In interviews decades later, residents recalled payments of less than 50 cents an acre. One man named Cole Hyatt fought the TVA's condemnation of his 225-acre farm with 2 houses. The settlement he received was only enough to buy 125 acres somewhere else, with no house at all. The communities of Fontana, Bushnell, Judson, Proctor, Forney, Medlin, Bone Valley, Hazel Creek, Japan, Almond, Gold Mine, and a dozen more, all gone. Swain County lost 25% of its population in a matter of months, and once the families cleared out, the TVA went through and knocked down what was left. They burned the houses, they burned the barns, they burned the outbuildings. The official reason was to prevent people from coming back, but the effect was something more permanent. It was erasure. The land itself, 44,170 acres, was transferred to the Department of the Interior and folded into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Between the national park that had already claimed land in the 1930s and the new Fontana acquisition, the federal government now owned 86% of Swain County. That left 14% of the county's land on the tax rolls. 14% to fund the schools, the roads, the emergency services, the whole operation of county government. The rest belonged to Washington. But the government said, "We will build you a road." On July 30th, 1943, while the dam was still under construction and the water had not yet risen, 4 parties signed a memorandum of agreement: the Tennessee Valley Authority, the United States Department of the Interior, the state of North Carolina, and Swain County. The agreement specified that the National Park Service would construct a road, roughly 30 miles long, along the north shore of the new Fontana Lake, from Bryson City westward to the Fontana Dam area. The road would replace the drowned Highway 288 and, crucially, would give the displaced families a way to reach the cemeteries they had left behind. 26 cemeteries dotted the hillsides above the North Shore, holding more than 1,000 graves. The agreement noted that the TVA would pay Swain County $400,000 for the loss of Highway 288, though that money actually went to the state of North Carolina to retire Swain County's outstanding road bonds, so the county itself never saw a dime of it. There was also a clause. There is always a clause. The agreement stated that the Department of the Interior was obligated to build the road only when, and this is the critical phrase, Congress appropriates the necessary funds. Not that Congress was obligated to appropriate the funds. Not that anyone, anywhere, was obligated to ask Congress for the funds. Just that when the funds materialized, the road would be built. The families who signed away their land, whose houses were already being knocked down and burned behind them as they packed their trucks, had no reason to parse the legal language of the clause. They were being told the road would come after the war. They believed it. A woman named Delia Woodard Watkins, one of the displaced residents, later recalled simply, "We all thought that the road was going to be built." The war ended. The road did not come. Not in 1945. Not in 1946, not in 1950. The country had other priorities. The returning soldiers needed jobs and houses, and the national parks budget was not where Congress wanted to spend its attention. A small 0.9-mile section was built on the Fontana Dam end in 1947 or 1948. Lakeview Drive West, they called it. But the main road from Bryson City, the one the agreement actually promised, did not break ground for more than 15 years. In 1959, the state of North Carolina finally built a section of road from Bryson City to the national park boundary, laying the groundwork for the Park Service to pick up construction inside the park. In 1960, Congressman Roy A. Taylor of North Carolina secured $8 million in federal funding, and the National Park Service started building. And then the mountain fought back. 2 miles into the route, engineers hit unstable rock. Not ordinary unstable rock. This was Anakeesta Formation, a type of slate and phyllite that is threaded with iron sulfide minerals. In its natural state, buried deep and unexposed to air, it is inert. But when you blast it open and leave it exposed to oxygen and rain, it undergoes a chemical reaction. The iron sulfides oxidize. They produce sulfuric acid. The acid leaches into the groundwater and runs off into the nearest stream. And it does exactly what sulfuric acid does. It kills everything in the water. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but too good not to mention, that someone first noticed the problem when snowflakes melted unusually quickly on the freshly blasted rock faces, and the air carried a sharp smell of sulfur. Whether that specific observation happened or not, the chemistry was real and undeniable. Continuing the road would mean blasting through miles of Anakeesta, and every mile would create another source of acid drainage pouring into the streams that fed Fontana Lake, inside one of the most visited national parks in the country. Construction slowed. A 1962 Park Service report suggested it might be in the public interest to seriously reconsider the plan. But construction did not stop, not yet. Through the 1960s, crews kept working painfully slowly, carving out switchbacks and grading the roadbed through the ridges above the lake. They built a bridge over Noland Creek, and they blasted the tunnel. The tunnel deserves its own moment because it is the physical center of this whole story, the object that embodies both the ambition and the futility. It is 1,200 feet long, cut straight through a ridge of the Smokies, wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic. It was designed so that cars could drive from Bryson City through the mountains and out the other side toward the lake and the lost communities beyond. Crews drilled and blasted and reinforced it, and when they were done, it was a perfectly functional road tunnel. It sits there today, pitch black inside, unlit, its floor uneven, water dripping from the ceiling in places. No car has ever driven through it. No headlights have ever swept across its walls in the course of ordinary travel. It was built for a road that doesn't exist on its far side. By 1971, after roughly a decade of sporadic construction at a cost of about $4 million, the Park Service stopped. They had built just under 6 miles of road from the park boundary, the Noland Creek Bridge, and the tunnel. 24 miles remained unbuilt. The environmental problems with the Anakeesta rock were deemed too severe and too expensive to mitigate, and there was, frankly, a larger calculation at work. The federal government did not want to keep spending massive sums on a road that would serve a relatively small number of people in a rural Appalachian county. The road was supposed to connect Bryson City to Fontana and open the North Shore to tourism and economic development. By 1971, the political will for that vision had evaporated, and so the road stopped. The tunnel just sat there, a quarter-mile hole in a mountain, waiting for traffic that never came. The forest crept back in on the far side. Vines covered the portal. Water pooled on the roadbed. Graffiti appeared on the tunnel walls, and the displaced families, many of whom were now in their 50s and 60s, looked at the road and gave it a name. They called it the Road to Nowhere. Someone, locals disagree on who, exactly, put up a sign near the entrance to Lakeview Drive, red, white, and blue. It reads, "Welcome to the Road to Nowhere, a broken promise. 1943-2, and in smaller letters, no more wilderness." That question mark is doing a lot of work. Now, the families could have given up. The road was dead. The federal government had bigger problems. But these were Appalachian mountain people, and they had buried their grandparents and great-grandparents on those hillsides across the lake, and they were not finished. In 1974, a group of Swain County residents traveled to Raleigh to meet with the North Carolina Attorney General, Robert Morgan. They wanted the state's help suing the federal government. Morgan looked at the 1943 agreement, found the hold harmless clause and the congressional appropriation contingency, and told them they had no grounds for a lawsuit. The promise had been written so that it could not be enforced. They tried again. In the early 1980s, a group of citizens filed a federal lawsuit against all the original signatories of the 1943 agreement, asking the court to either compel the government to build the road or lower the lake. The lead plaintiff was a woman named Helen Vance. Helen Cable Vance was born in Proctor on November 28, 1926. She spent her childhood in the Hazel Creek Valley, in the community that had boardwalks and a movie theater and a sawmill the size of a factory. She was about 18 years old when her family had to leave in 1944. She watched the water rise over the places where she had grown up. The lawsuit, Vance versus Tennessee Valley Authority, went to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled in 1984 that the Department of the Interior was not bound to complete the road because Congress had not appropriated the necessary funds. The families appealed to the Supreme Court. The court refused to hear the case. The legal logic was airtight and devastating. The 1943 agreement said the road would be built when Congress appropriated the money. Congress never appropriated the money. Therefore, the promise was never triggered. Therefore, the promise was never broken. The government had written itself an escape hatch and then walked through it. But Helen Vance was not a person who accepted that kind of logic as the final word. In 1976, during the country's bicentennial celebrations, she organized a reunion for the displaced North Shore families at Deep Creek, near Bryson City. More than 400 people came from 8 states. They were old and getting older, and they hadn't been together in decades. And they brought food and instruments and stories, and they sang in the way that mountain people sing at graveside, not for performance, but for remembrance. That same year, Helen chartered a boat and crossed Fontana Lake with a few relatives. They were looking for Cable Cemetery, her family's burial ground. They found it in the state you would expect after 30 years of neglect. Overgrown, buried in leaves and brush, the stones tilted and invisible under decades of forest reclaiming the hillside. A mess. But the graves were still there. Helen convinced the National Park Service to clean it up. And in 1978, she and her family crossed the lake again, this time to hold Decoration Day. The old mountain tradition of tending the graves of the dead, placing flowers, singing hymns, sharing a meal on the ground among the headstones. It is one of the deepest rituals in Appalachian culture, and it had been interrupted for more than 3 decades by a body of water that the government put there. In 1977, Helen and her sister, Mildred Cable Johnson, co-founded the North Shore Cemetery Association, a nonprofit dedicated to gaining access to the 26 cemeteries scattered along the North Shore and keeping them from disappearing entirely. They negotiated with the Park Service. They organized volunteers. They kept the pressure on year after year until in 1984, the same year the courts told them the road would never be built, the Park Service agreed to a compromise. Every year, from April through October, rangers would ferry families across Fontana Lake by boat, maintain the trails to the cemeteries, and help coordinate the Decoration Day visits. It was not a road. It was not what they were promised, but it was something. Picture this. A summer morning, pontoon boats pulling out of Cable Cove, loaded with elderly men and women in rain ponchos, coolers full of casseroles, flower arrangements, one man carrying metal dowsing rods to find unmarked graves. They cross the lake, which covers their old roads and house foundations at a depth of 130 feet. They step off at a trailhead and hike into the backcountry of the Smokies, some of them in their 70s and 80s, to reach a hillside where the headstones of their great-great-grandparents lean against the slope. They clear the brush. They lay the flowers. Someone sings. They eat together on the ground, and then they get back on the boats and go home, because there is no road. Helen Vance did this every year for more than 40 years. She kept doing it into her 90s. Her sister Mildred was right beside her. They became the memory of a place that the map had erased. While the Decoration Days continued, the political fight dragged on in its own grinding way. In October 2000, Congressman Charles Taylor and Senator Jesse Helms secured $16 million in federal funding for the North Shore Road project. Hope flickered. But the money triggered a requirement for a National Environmental Policy Act analysis, and the options had to be studied, and the studies took years. And in 2003, a citizen group called the Citizens for the Economic Future of Swain County hired an accounting firm to calculate what the county was owed. They arrived at a figure, $52 million, based on the original cost of Highway 288, adjusted for inflation and interest. In January 2006, The Park Service released a draft environmental impact statement. It analyzed several alternatives: build the road, build part of the road, don't build the road, and concluded that the environmentally preferred option was a cash settlement. More than 76,000 public comments poured in. The vast majority came through emails and faxes organized by conservation groups opposed to the road. The environmental community did not want 30 miles of blacktop carved through one of the most pristine and least developed sections of the Great Smoky Mountains. They were, in an objective sense, probably right. The Anakeesta problem was real. The acid drainage would have been catastrophic, and the north shore of Fontana Lake had rewilded into some of the best backcountry east of the Mississippi. Building the road would have damaged it irreversibly. But that argument sits uneasily next to the fact that the wilderness only exists because the government displaced the people who were living there and then didn't build the road it promised to build. The pristine condition of the North Shore is, in a sense, the spoils of a broken promise. The forest grew back because the road never came, and the road never came because the government wrote itself a contingency clause in 1943, and the contingency clause held up in court because legal language and moral language are not the same thing. In December 2007, the Department of the Interior issued its final decision: monetary settlement, not road construction. In February 2010, Interior Secretary Ken Salazar signed the settlement agreement, $52 million paid into a trust fund for Swain County. He called it an end to a 67-year controversy. The first installment, $12.8 million, was delivered. And then the money stopped again. A $4 million payment appropriated in 2011 was rescinded in a federal spending freeze. For years, nothing came. By 2016, Swain County had received only $12 million of the $52 million it was owed, and the commissioners voted unanimously to sue the federal government. Again. In 2018, 75 years after the original agreement, the Department of the Interior finally paid the remaining $35.2 million. The ceremony was held at the Swain County Heritage Museum in Bryson City. The county commission chairman, Phil Carson, stood at the podium and said what needed to be said. "This is your money, Swain County. The principal is held in trust by the state of North Carolina. The county receives only the interest. To spend any of the principal, 75% of the county's voters must approve it. $52 million. The dam cost $74.7 million in 1944 money. The land was taken for $37.76 an acre. The electricity went to Tennessee. The county's tax base was cut to 14% of its land. The road was never built. The settlement, for what it is worth, generates interest payments for a county that still struggles to fund its own schools. And the tunnel still sits there. If you drive to Bryson City today, population roughly 1,500, and follow Everett Street north out of town, it becomes Fontana Road, and after about 2.5 miles, you will see the sign. The red, white, and blue one. A broken promise. Then you enter the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on Lakeview Drive, and for the next 6 miles, you drive a winding mountain road that is genuinely beautiful. Overlooks of Fontana Lake through the hardwoods, glimpses of ridgeline above, the road curving and climbing in the way mountain roads do. In October, when the leaves turn, it is one of the finest drives in the Smokies. And then it ends. You cross the Nolan Creek Bridge, pull into a small parking lot, and there it is, the tunnel. You can see the opening from the lot. A dark semicircle cut into the ridge, unremarkable from a distance. But when you walk up to it and step inside, the light drops away fast. The tunnel is completely unlit. The floor is cracked and uneven and sometimes wet. You can see the exit as a small bright circle far ahead. But between here and there is about a 1/4 mile of absolute darkness. Bring a flashlight. Horseback riders use the tunnel too, so watch your step. On the other side, The pavement stops. A gravel trail begins. This is the Lakeshore Trail, which runs 33 miles through the backcountry to Fontana Dam. It passes through the sites of the communities that were flooded or abandoned, the places where Proctor and Forney and the others used to be. If you hike far enough along Hazel Creek, you will find the Calhoun House, one of the few structures still standing from Proctor. The old Ritter lumber mill foundations are there too, in the brush, along with scattered artifacts that nobody has bothered to remove because you can only get there by boat or by a very long walk. In winter, when the TVA lowers the lake level, some of the old foundations and structures emerge from the water like bones surfacing through skin. Then the water rises again and they disappear. Helen Vance died on Thanksgiving Day, November 24, 2022, 4 days before what would have been her 96th birthday. She had spent the last 46 years of her life making sure that the history of the North Shore communities was not forgotten, that the graves were tended, that the decoration days continued, that the names of the towns were spoken aloud by people who remembered what they had been. She had been born in Proctor when it was a real place, and she outlived it by almost 80 years. Her sister Mildred was beside her for nearly all of it. When Helen and Mildred stepped down from the Cemetery Association, they passed the work to a man named Henry Chambers, whose family is also from the North Shore. He carries it now. Every summer, the Park Service still sends pontoon boats across Fontana Lake. The descendants climb aboard with their flowers and their covered dishes and their stories. They hike the trails to the cemeteries. They pull weeds from around the headstones. They sing. They eat lunch on the ground in the shade of trees that have grown up among the graves of people who never expected to be this hard to visit. And then they cross back. The sign near Bryson City still stands. A Broken Promise, 1943-2. The question mark has never been filled in because the people who put it there do not consider the matter closed. The settlement was money. The promise was a road. They are not the same thing. A study conducted during the environmental review found that the completed road would have brought an estimated 715 jobs to Swain County, $5.67 million in personal income, and $14.27 million in additional retail sales annually without, the study's authors concluded, harming the integrity of the park. Those numbers now belong to a future that didn't happen. There is something about this story that is not quite like other stories about broken government promises, and I have been trying to figure out what it is. I think it is this: the tunnel. The tunnel is the part that makes the road to nowhere different from every other bureaucratic failure in America. Because the tunnel is finished. It works. It does exactly what it was designed to do. It carries you through a mountain ridge and deposits you on the other side. It is a fully functional piece of infrastructure embedded in a project that was abandoned around it, and it has been sitting there, in the dark, doing nothing, for more than 50 years. It is not a ruin. It is not collapsed. It is not falling apart. It is a door to a room that was never built. Every year, a few 100,000 visitors drive to the end of Lakeview Drive, park their cars, and walk through the tunnel with flashlights. Some of them know the history. Some of them are just looking for a strange experience. They post photos of the dark portal on Instagram. They write about the ghost stories. And there are ghost stories because, of course, there are. A tunnel that goes nowhere in the mountains of Appalachia is going to collect ghost stories the way a creek bed collects leaves. But the real haunting is not in the tunnel. The real haunting is on the other side, where the trail leads out through the forest to a lake shore that used to be a valley. And beneath the water there are roads and foundations and fence lines in the places where people were born and married and died and buried. And above the water there are 26 cemeteries on 26 hillsides, and someone still comes every summer to clear the brush and lay the flowers because the dead do not move, and the living remember where to find them. The tunnel is 1,200 feet long. It took the government 20 years to build 6 miles of road to reach it. It took 75 years to settle the bill for the road that was supposed to go beyond it. The road was never built. The tunnel has no purpose. But every year people walk through it anyway, into the dark and out the other side, because on the far side of nowhere, their people are still there.